to us.
And thank you for telling everyone about what's coming up with the library, because I'm so proud of it and proud of you for there's so much work involved now during this pandemic. Good afternoon, friends and newcomers to our Friday special conversations with special people. I'm so happy to introduce our very special guest today, John Gruesser, formerly professor of English at Penn University and now professor at San Houston State University. John first spoke here, believe it or not, on October 31st, 2013, on the topic, Eat My Shorts, the Life, Literature, and Legacy of Edgar Allan Poe. And then the following year, in March, he was so wonderful, I asked him to come back, of course, and he did select readings from his book, A Century of Detection, 20 Great Mystery Stories, 1841 to 1940. Then he came back in October. I always had him for our Halloween, October 30th, 2014. He spoke on Poe, the Man and the Legend. The following year, October 29th, 2015, Poe in New York City. The following year, October 27th, Some Things You Might Not Know About Edgar Allan Poe. October 26, 2017, Poe and Hitchcock. And last year, January 24th, your latest book, Edgar Allan Poe and His 19th Century American Counterparts. Today's talk is on the best-selling book, Where the Crawdads Sing, and Edgar Allan Poe. Well, every time that you've spoken about Poe has been fascinating, and I've learned so much, and it really has enlightened us about he was very fascinating character, and you have made him even more fascinating. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our wonderful guest speaker, John Gruesser.
Thanks, Phyllis. I don't know if people have the audio on, but if you do, how many of you have read Where the Crawdads Sing? Anybody?
We don't have the audio on.
Oh, okay. Never mind. I just want to warn you, near the end of my talk today, there are going to be two places where there are going to be spoilers. So if you don't want to know, if you haven't read the book yet, and you don't want to know the solution to the mystery because you might read it, I'll give you that warning, and then we'll you just cover your ears for about 30 seconds each time, and then it won't be a spoiler for you. All right. The title of my talk today is The Crawdads Sing in Poe Country, Delia Owens' bestseller, and the Gold Buff. Published by G.P. Putnam's Sons in August 2018, Delia Owens' Where the Crawdads Sing had sold 4.5 million copies by the beginning of this year, and it has spent 93 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, more than 30 of them at #1. And as of this last weekend, it was #1 again. According to a front page article in the Times, quote, as the end of 2019 approaches, Crawdads has sold more print copies than any other adult title this year, fiction or nonfiction, according to NPD Bookscan, blowing away the combined print sales of new novels by John Grisham, Margaret Atwood, and Stephen King. Putnam has returned to the printers nearly 40 times to feed the seemingly bottomless demand for the book. Foreign rights have sold in 41 countries. And that's the end of that quotation. Moreover, Fox 2000 has acquired the film rights, with Reese Witherspoon slated to produce the adaptation. As reviewers have noted, one reason for the narrative's remarkable splash lies in its effective mixings of genres or types of literature. Marilyn Stasio of the New York Times describes it as, quote, a painfully beautiful first novel that is at once a murder mystery, a coming-of-age narrative, and a celebration of nature, unquote. Surprisingly, no one, however, has connected it to the writings of the acknowledged originator of modern detective fiction, Edgar Allan Poe. Because Owens's novel challenges Poe's 1843 tale, The Gold Bug, in fascinating, and strategic ways. Looking at these narratives together helps to explain the success of both. So that's my introduction. I'm going to talk about Poe for a while. Some of you may know the Gold Bug, some of you may not. I'll give you the history of that, and then I will get to Where the Crawdads Sing. In an August 9, 1846 letter, Poe explained his method for writing detection. The trick, he tells Philip Pendleton Cook, is to work backwards. First inventing a character that commits the crime or otherwise sets the mystery in motion, and then creating a second character, the detective figure, that solves it. Where is the ingenuity, Poe writes, in unraveling a web which you yourself, the author, have woven? When asked which part of Where the Crawdads Sing she liked best, Delia Owens said, quote, "the ending. The idea for the ending came to me suddenly, so I started there. Then I jumped back to the beginning and braided the two storylines together towards the end. Weaving together all the pieces, the characters, the clues, the feathers, and the shells was so much fun," unquote. Here she not only evokes Poe's methodology, working backwards, but through the words braided and weaving, his sewing imagery as well. The Gold Bug enjoyed instant, widespread, and enduring popularity. In 1843, it won the $100 top prize for the best story in a contest run by the Philadelphia Dollar newspaper, where it appeared with 2 illustrations by Felix Darley, commissioned by Poe itself. And these are really the only illustrations for Poe stories that we know that he approved of, because he recruited Darley to do them. Several papers in the United States reprinted the tale in 1843 and subsequent years. Wiley and Putnam publishers included it in the 1845 collection of Poe's tales, and a pirated British version appeared in 1846. 6 years later, the London publisher Vizetelly brought out a volume of Poe's stories and poems featuring 28 illustrations, 8 of which, by far the highest total, were inspired by the Gold Bug, which remains Poe's most frequently illustrated fiction. As early as 1856, London's Boys' Own magazine reprinted the tale, and standalone editions of the story, targeted at children and featuring such things as glossaries, maps, instructions for teachers, and illustrations, began appearing at the end of the 1800s in the Young at Heart, Canterbury Classics, Graded Classics, Journeys Through Bookland, and Children's Classic series. Comic book versions followed soon afterwards in the United States and elsewhere, with several graphic renditions appearing between the 1940s and the 1960s. In addition to the many 19th century reprints of the Gold Bug in English, translations were published early on and with increasing frequency. French, German, and Russian versions were issued in 1845, 1846, and 1847, respectively. And there was one in Spanish by 1858 and one in Italian by 1876. In 1864, Jules Verne, you of course know him as the author of Journey to the Center of the Earth and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and many other famous novels. Verne published a substantial essay summarizing and offering critical assessments of several Poe texts, which states of the Gold Bug, quote, "In my opinion, it is the most remarkable of all of these extraordinary stories, the one in which is revealed to the highest degree the literary genre now called Poe," unquote. Verne asserts that Poe produced a literature so unique it deserved its own category, its own genre in a sense. To put it another way, Poe carved out his own country or realm of the imagination, where he will forever rule as the unchallenged despot. The unique combination of elements, namely detection, adventure, buried treasure, pirate lore, and racial humor and caricature of the Gold Bug, has accounted for its popularity and influence on popular culture from the mid-19th century to today. Certainly the fantasy of acquiring fabulous wealth has contributed to its enduring appeal, and pirates add an additional dimension to Poe's tale that has captured the imagination of readers, illustrators, and film directors. One of these film directors, Alfred Hitchcock, described The Gold Bug as a story that, quote, fascinated me and fascinates me still because I always loved adventure, unquote. He characterized Poe's story of treasure, which one finds thanks to a mysterious beetle, as one that corresponds to my love, this is Hitchcock, my love of the fantastic and of precision. Hitchcock, who as a young man published short stories. Did you know that? I didn't know that until relatively recently. Many with twist endings, differentiates film from fiction as follows. Quote, in cinematographic style, suspense consists in inciting a breathless curiosity and in establishing a complicity between the director and the spectator who knows what's going to happen. Let me just interrupt Hitchcock for a second. The famous example he gave is you put a bomb under a table and you let the audience, the film viewers, know that the bomb is there. Then you have a bunch of characters sitting around the table who don't know the bomb is there. That, says Hitchcock, is how you create suspense, because the viewer is going to say, get out of there, there's a bomb under the table. Okay, back to Hitchcock, though, on Poe. In a book, however, a reader must never guess what is going to happen and must not know the unraveling of the intrigue before getting to the end, unquote. Note the director's use of unraveling, the word that Poe employs in his letter to Cook. Featuring a brilliant puzzle-solving protagonist, The Gold Bug has been the tale of detective fiction by Poe, most frequently adapted by filmmakers, with the exception of The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is the very first detective story. It is all by Poe. It has also been the urtext for countless motion pictures featuring fortune hunters endeavoring to decipher treasure maps and find pirate booty, including all of the Treasure Island films and the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. By no means do I wish to minimize the substantial differences between Poe's antebellum short story and Owens's contemporary novel. The former uses a first-person narrator to tell a tale of a patrician, middle-aged detective who cracks an arcane cryptographic mystery, engages in a convoluted treasure hunt, and eventually succeeds in unearthing untold riches, thereby reversing his fortunes. Meanwhile, the latter, written in the third person, focuses on a young woman who grows up an impoverished, ostracized, illiterate, backwoods orphan, and when she is later accused of murder, devotes several chapters to a riveting small-town courtroom drama, not unlike Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, in a case that remains officially unsolved. Beyond this, the violence in Poe's tale takes place exclusively between men, whereas in Owens' novel, it occurs between men and women. Yet despite these contrasts and the 175 years that separate them, the narratives have similar settings, protagonists, and supporting characters. Moreover, each has a map of the local area, coded messages, an irresistible mystery that drives the plot, and an extended deception perpetrated by the author, as well as the revelation of conclusive evidence related to murder. Both writers placed their stories on islands in the Carolinas, a region famous as a haven for buccaneers. The main character of The Gold Bug lives in an isolated cabin on Sullivan's Island, north of Charleston, which was the major depot for enslaved persons arriving in the United States from the West Indies and Africa. It was a place well known to Poe from his time as a soldier, as he had been stationed at Fort Moultrie on the island's southern tip. Owens sets her novel about a girl who grows up on her own in a ramshackle shack between the early 1950s and early 1970s on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Largely underdeveloped during much of the 20th century, in recent years, this 200-mile chain of barrier islands has become a major vacation spot, attracting people from across the country. My family's actually going there next week. In addition, a specific location high above the ground plays a prominent role in each fiction. In Poe's tale, a key scene takes place on a branch far up in and at the foot of an immense tulip tree. Similarly, the pivotal event in Where the Crawdads Sing involves a fatal plunge from a long abandoned fire tower that rises 65 feet above the marsh below. In each text, the protagonist is an eccentric, artistically talented naturalist alienated from his or her relatives and other people. The scion of a Louisiana French Protestant family that has fallen on hard times, Poe's William Legrand resides in the woods and spends much of his time observing, collecting, and drawing the local flora and fauna, including the titular goldbug. Deserted by her battered mother, abandoned by her imperiled siblings, and finally left on her own by her abusive father, Kaya Clark somehow manages to support herself in a remote dwelling devoid of modern amenities. Like Legrand, she spends much of her time studying, writing about, and painting the natural world around her. And as with him, people question her sanity. Loyal older Black men with similar names figure in both texts. Legrand lives with and is waited on by Jupiter, who, although legally free, refuses to leave the side of his massa will, and serves as the butt of the racist humor in the story through his non-standard and malaprop-filled language, exaggerated minstrel show gestures, and inability to tell his left from his right. The owner of a gas station that also sells basic foodstuffs, Owen's character Jumpin', who is forced to live in Colored Town rather than Barclay Cove because of Jim Crow, functions as a lifeline for Kaya, whom the local whites have rejected. He buys the fish she catches and the mussels she digs up and provides her with fuel on credit. His wife Mabel also assists Kaya in giving her secondhand clothes and sorely needed advice about certain things, including the onset of menstruation. Unlike several later editions of the story, Poe's original does not reproduce Captain Kidd's treasure map, but it does describe it. It does describe what is written and drawn on it in extensive detail, making it appear theoretically possible for a reader to crack the cryptogram. Once Legrand deciphers it, the map serves as the itinerary that he follows in search for the treasure. Owen's novel includes an actual map of the local area between the dedication page and the prologue that has 7 locations labeled in all capital letters. Barclay Cove lies in the middle at the top, with Colored Town to the west and the fire tower to the east. South of this, across a bay, Jumpin's bait and gas shop is found. And then further south of that, at the bottom, roughly in the middle, is Kaya's shack, with her even more secluded reading cabin to the northwest and Point Beach to the northeast. In another link to the gold bug, where the Crawdads Sing includes its own coded messages, as Owen reproduces several poems by Amanda Hamilton, later revealed to be Kaya herself, whose verses about nature, mating rituals, romance, and death offer insights into her character and information about her actions. Perhaps most significantly, each fiction has a multifaceted mystery that generates considerable suspense, thereby moving the plot forward. In the gold bug, which we might call the where is it, one question leads to the next, namely, what has Legrand found? What do the markings on it mean? Can he decode them? And will they indeed guide him to Captain Kidd's treasure? Such that the reader's initial skepticism gives way to curiosity, followed by anticipation, and finally, amazement. In Where the Crawdads Sing, a whodunit, so much turns on Chase Andrews' fall. Was it an accident or was he pushed? Did Kaya have any role in this incident? Has the criminal justice system gone too far in prosecuting her with only circumstantial evidence? And can she receive a fair trial in a town that's prejudiced against her, such that it is all but impossible for the reader not to root for her acquittal? Each text features a friend of the protagonist who serves as a gullible role model for the reader, thereby significantly aiding in an elaborate deception carried out by the author. Convinced that Legrand's mental health has been compromised, Poe's narrator has no faith in the search for gold, and yet, against his will, and similar to the reader, he becomes caught up in the exhilaration of the quest and experiences astonishment and elation when the treasure is found. Near the end of the story, Legrand admits to feigning madness by insisting on carrying the gold bug on a string during the hunt and commanding Jupiter to drop it through the eye socket of the skull, which is nailed to a high branch of the tulip tree, in order to punish the narrator by means of mystification for doubting his mental competence. An unsigned review of the 1845 edition of Poe's Tales, believed by many scholars to have been written by Poe himself, spells out the author's deception. Quote, "The bug, which gives the title to the story, is used by way of mystification, having throughout a seeming and no real connection to the subject. Its purpose is to seduce the reader into the idea of supernatural machinery and keep him so mystified until the last moment." Unquote. In other words, the reader thinks that there's something weird about this bug, that the bug has some sort of occult power. But meanwhile, that's really not what the story is about. It's really about deciphering this map and finding the treasure. But Poe does a lot of this. I do a lot of work with detective fiction. And one thing that Raymond Chandler said is that really what you need to do to be successful as a writer of detective fiction is to get the reader to solve the wrong problem. To get the reader to think that the story is really about one thing when it's actually about something else. Okay, getting back to Owens, in much the same way, Owens uses Tate, who serves as a teacher for, falls in love with, at one point timidly stays away from, and eventually becomes the long-term significant other of Kaya, to carry out, but at the very end be the means of exposing the deception. Okay, here's the spoiler alert. All of you people who don't want to hear it, 30 seconds, cover your ears. The deception that Kaya is innocent, as Tate has no inkling that she brilliantly planned and executed the killing of Chase until after her death, when he finds a secret compartment in her shack containing incriminating evidence. Okay, you can now uncover your ears. I'm back to a part of the paper that doesn't have any spoilers. Poe's story ends with Legrand speculating about the skeletons found in the hole where the treasure was buried, expressing his very plausible view that Captain Kidd killed the men who helped him hide the treasure in order to ensure that no one but he would know its location. Owens' novel concludes with, okay, here's the second spoiler alert, cover your ears for 30 seconds, right? So Owens' novel concludes with Tate's discovery of the missing seashell necklace Kaya gave to Chase that was found on his dead body, as well as the Amanda Hamilton poem Firefly, a thinly veiled confession of murder, which through its insect subject matter serves as another significant link to Poe's tale. Okay, you can now uncover your ears. I'm now at my final paragraph, and it's relatively short, so here goes. When she was a young girl in Georgia, Owens' mother told her to venture deep into the wilderness, saying, "Go way yonder where the crawdads sing." And that is precisely what she has done in her first novel. The place that she journeys to is Poe country, not just an all but pristine natural habitat within a few miles of the Carolina coast, but also an imaginary world of the author's own creation. Here Owens, in her novel, similar to Poe in his tale, has complete control, stitching together multiple literary strands to produce a tapestry that entertains, informs, captivates, manipulates, and ultimately astounds readers. Thank you very much.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. For those who haven't read it yet, now they all have to read it. And any questions? Is there any questions?
You can unmute yourself if you have a question.
Michael, why don't you just unmute everyone?
I can't do that.
Oh.
I have a question. Why do you think this book has such broad wide-ranging popularity, given the nature of its somewhat sad and depressive perspective on life, and this poor girl who's living in a swamp by herself?
Well, I mean, I think Marilyn Staso is onto something that it appeals. It checks a lot of boxes. I mean, it is a very satisfying mystery story, but it's also a coming of age story. And we really identify with Kaya, and you know, even if we have problems with some of the things she does, I think we can't help but admire the resilience that she shows. But Owens herself is a naturalist. I mean, this is her first novel. She's now 70 years old, but she's written a number of books, and so she's very knowledgeable about nature. So that's another way in which the book is satisfying. So I think because it kind of delivers on at least those three levels very successfully, that helps to account for its popularity. Any other questions or comments that people have?
John, Terry.
Yes.
I read a lot of these books in high school, Telltale Heart, Murder in the Rue Morgue, and which really fleshed it out, I think, was I'm a real movie buff, so just to see it in action, like Vincent Price was one of my better actors, because I think he could play the whole genre of types of movies, and for him to be in things like The Fall of the House of the Usher and The Pit and the Pendulum, I mean, it just puts you right there at the scene of what's actually going on. So just to read Poe, he was always the type of writer that really held your attention, no matter what, So I think he's one of, yeah.
And it's estimated that after Shakespeare, Poe has inspired more films than any other author. And I think it's because there's something so visual about his scenes, which is we have a very vivid idea in our mind of what things look like. So I think for that reason, film directors want to take on the challenge of trying to capture that on celluloid. The danger, of course, is that everybody kind of has their own picture in his or her mind. And if the director's version doesn't necessarily correspond to our own, then we could be disappointed in the film.
True. Another question about Poe. Now, they always said he was a strange type of individual. I don't know if he was into opium or other things, but it always seemed like he had a dark side type of character, very gloomy type of individual.
Well,
So
there's definitely the Halloween Poe, the very gothic Poe, the Poe of the horror tales. But Poe had many sides, and there are descriptions of him playing leapfrog in their cottage out in the Bronx. His wife and himself playing leapfrog. She was a good pianist. He loved to hear her play. So that there's this other side of Poe that we don't hear about, because we normally hear about Poe, or especially hear about Poe, come Halloween time. And my most recent book, here's a shameless plug, is entitled Edgar Allan Poe and His 19th Century American Counterparts. And it really does talk about Poe being, very much a person of his times. And the hardcover was very expensive. but the softcover version is supposed to come out this month, so that'll be a little bit more affordable if any of you are interested.
Okay. Okay. Matter of fact, I went past the area where he had a house. I knew he had a house in New York, and the idea was to go by and take a look, where the spot that had a plaque up that this was the spot of the old house where he grew up in a little bit in New York.
Yeah, the Poe
ago.
Cottage is still in the Bronx. It's not in its original
Right.
location. They moved it about a mile away from there. But there is actually a
Right.
Poe Place, which I think is where that plaque is you're talking about. But there's also a Poe House in Philadelphia. And there's a Poe House in Baltimore. And there's a Poe Museum in Richmond as well. And
very interesting.
And now there's a Poe Square in Boston with a Poe statue right off of Boston Commons. So you can go right down the East Coast and stop at a Poe location. There's one every 2 hours or so.
Okay. It's very interesting.
Anybody else have questions or comments?
Yeah. I'd like to ask about Delia Owens. I read the book and it was marvelous. I was just so fascinated with it. What other books has she written?
I don't know the titles, but as I say, they tend to be, they're about nature. She is a naturalist, so that they're nonfiction books. This is her first work of fiction. Okay. So she waited a long time, but boy, did she get it right, huh?
Right. Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. I will ask the librarians if we have any of her books. That would be interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
You bet. Anyone else?
Well,
I still have to read Crawdads, and so I'm thinking that all of my questions will occur long after this discussion. But I'm looking forward to reading it.
Well, I just send them to Phyllis, and Phyllis will send them to me. I'd be happy to answer them.
definitely.
Okay.
John, I have a question.
Yes.
How young were you when you got so, interested and excited about Poe's work? Because obviously, you've read probably all of them, and you're such an admirer of his. I just would like to know when you started this. Was it a teacher? Was it someone in the family that you have to read?
It was actually my mother. My mother had a college textbook, and I still have it, a modern library, the Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe, originally published in 1938, and it has her maiden name, her signature in it, Eileen Cullen. That was her maiden name, and I believe it was the summer of the year that I was 13. I tried to read all of Poe's tales, and I didn't make it all the way through. But I still have the check marks next to all of the stories that I did read, which was a fair number of them. But one of the reasons that I couldn't get all the way through was because of his vocabulary. I was always having to stop and look up words. So I learned a lot of words. It was good for me, but it slowed me down. It prevented me from finishing them all that summer.
That's fascinating.
One thing I want to recommend to people, if you're not familiar with it, is there is a wonderful website devoted to Edgar Allan Poe. It's just eapoe.org. So the letter E, the letter A is for Edgar Allan. So eapoe, .org, O-R-G. And that is the website of the Baltimore Edgar Allan Poe Society. You can access everything that Poe published and multiple versions of the things that he published. But you can also access criticism on him. It's remarkable. Jeffrey Savoy is the one who created it and maintains it, and it's really a national treasure. So you know, if you're saying, oh my God, where can I get a story by Poe, go to eapoe.org and it's all there.
Very good. Very good.
And also, on one of your talks, you described how he had died, and there was a question about it. Would you explain it to the people who may have missed that meeting?
So Poe was found outside of a tavern, which was also a polling place in the city of Baltimore in October of 1849. And he was delirious. He was not himself. He was then taken to the Washington College Hospital, and he never really regained consciousness. He kind of was raving, but he never came to himself. And he died 3 days later. The official death certificate says that he died of a brain lesion, but there have been all sorts of theories as to how he died. Some people have suggested alcohol poisoning. And to get back to an earlier question, Poe was not a drug addict. The only time that he took opium is he tried to commit suicide one time, and he took like a ball of laudanum, which is a kind of opium in solid form. And he threw it up, so it didn't kill him. Thank goodness. This was, I believe that was in 1848. He did have a drinking problem, but his drinking problem was one where he could not handle alcohol at all. So a very small amount of alcohol produced very extreme effects. And so, you know, he was not somebody who was drunk all the time, because he wouldn't have been able to make it. He wouldn't have been able to function. So he did have times where he fell off the wagon and he went out carousing, and there were bad consequences, but those happened, you know, on an intermittent basis. So that's one theory, is that it was alcohol poisoning. You know, people have suggested rabies, people have suggested hyperglycemia. But one theory that got a lot of popularity in the 19th century, and a lot of people believe it still might be true today, is that Poe was a victim of cooping. So what cooping is during an election, a political party would have this area where they would get these unsuspecting victims, and they would either get them drunk, or they would pour some sort of drug into a person's drink and get them in this kind of delirious state, and then take them to all different polling places around the city to get them to vote multiple times. You know, kind of like Chicago used to be, and I guess maybe Florida still is. But the reason that people think that this might have happened to Poe is not only that he was found outside of this polling place, but also because he was wearing clothes that were clearly not his own. Poe was very poor most of his life, but he was a kind of Southern gentleman. So he may have only had one good suit, but he would have worn that good suit. So for him not to be wearing clothes that were his is very unusual. And you know, what happened with these cooping is they would, you know, they'd have somebody go vote somewhere, then they'd bring them back to the coop where they kept these people, have them change their clothes and send them out to vote again. So that's one theory of how Poe may have died.
Very interesting.
Everyone's going to look into that first.
No, we can't go to vote in person anymore. We got to mail it in.
And then there was a mystery, you know, because Poe's life is mysterious, just as so much of his fiction is mysterious. There was a mystery involving his gravesite. So Poe was initially buried in 1849 in an unmarked grave in the Westminster burial grounds in the city of Baltimore. In 1875, he was dug up and he was buried underneath this monument. Both he and his wife Virginia were buried there, and that's where his remains remain today. And there was a ceremony, and a number of people were invited. The only famous person or famous writer who went was Walt Whitman, and Whitman didn't speak that day, but he wrote about that experience. And Whitman has fascinating things to say about Poe. And another shameless plug here, if you want to read about some of those, get my new book, because I talk about Whitman, what Whitman said about Poe. But anyways, beginning on the 100th anniversary of Poe's death, so in 1949, a mysterious caped figure started to appear in the Westminster burial grounds early in the morning of Poe's birthday, January 19th. And he would keep the cape in front of his face. And then he would go to this mausoleum or statue of Poe's, and he would leave 3 red roses and an open bottle of cognac. And that happened for 60 years. So from the 100th anniversary of Poe's death in 1949 until the 200th anniversary of his birth in 2009. Now, Jeff Jerome, who was the longtime curator of the Baltimore Poe House, believes that it was perhaps a father and son, that a father started to do it and he passed it on to the son, which would explain how it could happen for 60 years. Now, since 2009, there have been a lot, and by the way, this person is known as the Poe Toaster. Not the appliance, but toaster in the sense of, because he brings the bottle of cognac, toasting Poe on his birthday. Now, but since 2009, a lot of phony Poe toasters have showed up. One of them, I think a couple years ago, nearly impaled himself trying to climb over the wall, which has big spikes on it. But the real Poe toaster has not come back since 2009.
Very interesting.
What a story. What a story. That's interesting.
Your books and yourself, it was so wonderful of you to speak today. And I know that you'll be in Texas in the fall, but would you speak again in October, the end of October?
I don't know if I can come October. Maybe I can come in January. I'm normally back here in January. Perhaps I can come around the time of Poe's birthday again.
That would be wonderful.
And bring the rose and cognac.
Bring the cognac.
Oh, toaster. Oh, toaster.
I'm going to jump in here as the librarian who just did a little research in the background. And Delia Owens and her husband Mark lived in Africa for many years. So they published a book in 1984, The Cry of the Kalahari, and another one in 2000 something 6. Secrets of the Savannah, and they have just published something called A Life in the Wild, also about their time in Africa, studying everything from elephants to gorillas to hyenas and all sorts of things. So that's her naturalist bent, and she certainly did kick whatever with her first fiction book as well. So, and
Melissa?
John, will you just give a really quick summary of what the Hired Hand is about, just because the library has that, maybe somebody would be interested in that whole approach to writing a book too, taking an ancient book or a very old book and then looking at it with a researcher's eyes.
Right. The Hindered Hand was a novel that was published in 1905 by Sutton E. Griggs, who was African-American minister, Baptist minister, was born in Texas and spent most of his career in Tennessee. And he wrote 5 novels. 4 of which he published through his own publishing company. So he's unique because there were not many Black Southern novelists at the time, and there were even fewer Black publishers at the time. So The Hindered Hand is his longest novel, and the title is a reference to a biblical verse. It's Psalms 68:31, which says that princes shall come out of Egypt, and Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands to God. And this inspired a belief in Ethiopianism, which was the belief that African peoples had been great at one point, and they were destined to be great again. And this biblical verse was an indication of that. The Hindered Hand is, the subtitle of the book is The Reign of the Repressionist. So what Griggs is suggesting is that white Southerners and white authors like Thomas Dixon Jr., who published The Leopard Spots and The Klansman, books that inspired the infamous film Birth of the Nation, these repressionists were hindering that hand that African people were reaching forth to God. And in fact, on the cover of the novel, there's an illustration of a white hand trying to pull down or hinder a Black hand. And actually, what Melissa is referring to is that in 2017, a colleague and I did a scholarly edition of this 1905 book. So we basically put it into its historical context and created annotations for it. I'm actually writing a literary biography of Griggs right now, and I just finished the chapter that'll be the longest chapter of the book, which is on The Hindered Hand. It's about 80 pages long. So don't get me started. I can talk a long time about The Hindered Hand.
Well, you're wonderful and fascinating, and it's such a pleasure to have you as our guest today.
Well, it's wonderful to be here as always. And Phyllis, you're terrific. These programs mean a lot to people, and they only happen, or they largely happen, because of you.
You are so
Yes, definitely.
Hey.
I benefit the most from it because I've learned so much from you and the others. So thank you. Thank you. And all of you have a wonderful weekend, and everyone should be healthy and stay safe. And John, like I say, good luck to you in Texas. And whenever you come back, please check in with us. And of course, you know, it's never too soon for me to book you for January.
All right, we'll talk, Phyllis, and goodbye, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, John.